So, storytelling is the soul of science communication. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jilika Trisal and I'm serving in the capacity of the Chief International Officer of Project Encephalon, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Science storytelling can be a powerful way to nurture engagement with science, and stories help people to understand, process, we call science-related information. To throw more light on this, I'd like to invite Siddharth Kankaria. Siddharth Kankaria is a science communicator and researcher interested in developing community-centric science engagement practices for the global south. I'd like to welcome Siddharth with a virtual round of applause, and the stage is all yours. Siddharth, you're not audible. Poonam, can you hear Siddharth?
No, we cannot.
No, not yet. I still see mute. No.
I think so. You want to rejoin? Is it possible for you to rejoin?
Yeah, Siddharth, you might want to rejoin.
Can you guys hear me now? All right, great.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Let me just share my screen. All right. Can everybody see my screen?
Yeah.
All right, great. Thank you so much for that really kind introduction, Jalika. And I'm very, very delighted to be here today. Hello, everyone. And I just want to emphasize before I begin that I don't want this to be a lecture where I'm speaking and everybody is silent. So if there is a way for everyone to contribute and sort of talk to me, that would really be great. So I'm currently looking at my screen and I might not be able to hit the chat box. So if people can just speak up when they want to, I think that would be nice. All right. Hello everyone and welcome. So today we're going to be talking about using storytelling for communicating science. Um, Before we begin, let's do a small exercise. So I want to understand what are you expecting from today's session. So if you could write maybe a few words, maybe 2 or 3 words or one phrase in this link that I'm going to share. So I'm going to share a link soon and you can type into that. And I also want you to rate 2 statements which are on the scale of 1 to 10. So the first statement is stories form an essential component of science communication. And I feel confident about using storytelling in my science communication, right? I want you to rate both of these statements on a scale of 1 to 10. Again, like Shreya and Somdata, I'm also using Menti today. So if you could just go to menti.com and type in the code 96350392, you should be able to see it. Just let me know if you have any issues. I'll also write it on the chat box. All right. I can see science, I can see writing. That was in the title. Great. Anything else? Insightful methods, storytelling, engaging conversation, impact, communicate effectively, storytelling techniques. Great. I'll still wait for a few seconds. All right. How to structure writing, history of science, basics of psychom. Okay, great. connect, feedback, awareness, reason, simplicity, method, incorporating storytelling. Really interesting. Basics of psychom, ideas, interactive awareness, fun. Great. All right. And I can also see the statements being rated. So stories form an essential component of science bracket communication is currently at 8.9, and I feel confident about using storytelling in my psychom is at 6.3. All right. That's really helpful. Right. So while you guys are still filling this up, I'm going to move on. Right. So let's discuss the plot for the day, right? So I see that a lot of you wrote very interesting things, including the history of science and ideas and basics of psychom. So I'm not going to be covering basics of psychom because I thought Samdata and Shreya had already covered it quite well. So the plot for the day and what we're going to be discussing in today's workshop is looking at science versus stories, and is that versus really a versus or is it actually together? Then we look at why psychom needs stories or why science needs stories. We are going to zoom into a little bit of about principles of storytelling. Then we're going to do an activity about crafting science stories, and then you're going to look at some storytelling hacks for science writing, and followed by a short Q&A in the end, right? Just to clarify, this was a longer workshop, which was about 3 hours, which was in person and had a lot of interactive elements. But because it has been adapted to an online thing, it's a lot more dense. So if at any point you feel that it's getting a little bit too much, or if you're feeling that you're not following, please feel free to interrupt me and stop me, and we can go slower or we can go over some things again. Also, I want to clarify that the session today is for an hour and a half, hour and 15 minutes. And I don't think anybody is going to learn how to do science writing effectively by the end of it. But what we will learn today in an hour basically would be to sort of a lot of considerations and strategies and hacks and pointers to think about how to structure your science writing in a more sort of creative and compelling way, right? So I just wanted to clarify that this is what I'm expecting to get out of the session, and it's nice to always be on the same page, right? I see that people are still filling in the form. Is everybody done? Can I move on? Right. Okay, so let's move on. Right. So the first thing that we're going to be looking at today is science versus stories, right? Now, I think all of us are scientists here, and I don't really need to define what is science. So I'm just going to focus on stories for now. So stories are basically a narrative which are designed to interest, amuse, or instruct the audience or reader. Stories often bring people together, and there is a way that stories build communities. And storytelling is, of course, a way to share and learn ideas, values, and practices. Now, if you think of storytelling, there are 3 C's that I like to focus on. The first C is content, which is basically the science or the issue or the kind of content that you want to communicate. The second is context. And by context, I mean the context of the science where it's happening, the institution, your background, and your story. But more importantly, the context of the audience you're trying to engage, right? So you might be reaching out to sort of a farmer community, you might be reaching out to students, you might be reaching out to people who are working as policymakers. So understanding the context of your audience is very, very important for crafting an effective story. And the last thing is connect, right? Now, once you have content and context, you really need to be able to connect both of these things together, and you need to be able to connect them, right? So storytelling is all about forming connections, as I said before. So I think the 3 C's of storytelling for us to remember for today's session is content, context, and connect, right? Is everybody clear with that? Anybody else has anything else to ask at this point? All right, I'm going to move on then. Right. So when we think of stories versus scientific reports, and I use the term scientific report to refer to both a scientific paper, or it could be a presentation that you're giving, or talk that you're giving, or it could be a grant proposal that you're writing. So any form of report or communication output that you might write in a scientific context is what I loosely mean by scientific report. Now, we're all familiar with the basic structure of a scientific report, which basically includes an introduction, a background or literature review, methods, results, discussion, and conclusion, right? Now, if you look at the elements of stories, there are also some things which are very, very interesting and are similar to a scientific report. So a character or talking about and introducing a character is somewhat similar to an introduction. sharing the context of a story is again similar to a literature review that we do. The plot or an action of a story is also has some similar elements as the methods of a scientific report. Results, if you focus on both the positive and negative results, which is something we're going to talk about later today, also has elements of tension and how you overcame a challenge. Resolution is basically when you have arrived at the conclusion or sort of a takeaway for your story, and that also has similarities with discussion and conclusion, right? So we can see that there are very vague similarities. I wouldn't compare stories and scientific reports all the time, but there are some vague similarities that we can relate to. And understanding these similarities and what section of the scientific report can help us formulate what element of the story is important as we go forward today. Now, there are some differences also between scientific reports and stories, right? The most important difference is the sequence of events or sequence of elements, right? In a scientific report, you usually start with the background, which is a smaller section. You talk about supporting details or the method section, which is slightly larger. And then you talk about the results and conclusion, which forms the most significant or substantial component of a scientific report. And this could also be for a scientific talk. But in a story, the bottom line or sort of the application or the end result or the societal connect is basically forms the biggest chunk, and then comes so what, and then comes the supporting details, right? So you see the sequence of things that goes in a story is slightly different from what we use in a conventional scientific report. And that's one difference to note. And this is something that we need to be aware of when we are trying to translate a scientific paper or a scientific study into a compelling and creative story. The next difference that we can see between scientific reports and stories is the audience, right? Now, scientific reports are usually meant for peers, for students or for scientists or people who are well versed within the technicalities of the field, versus science communication outputs like science writing or podcast or filmmaking are usually geared towards people who may not be an expert in science, but they may be an expert in something else, right? So it's very important to sort of understand that most scientific presentations or scientific papers are actually aimed towards presenting facts and evidence in a very objective and rigorous way, right? But most stories, on the other hand, are aimed towards making an emotional connection while also communicating some fact and evidence, but not in as a rigorous way as a scientific report. Stories also form a bridge between science and society, and I think that's also something important to remember as we go ahead. And the last thing that I want to focus on is the aims and the purposes of storytelling or science communication in general. As I said, the aims of a scientific report is to present facts and evidence in a rigorous way. But for a story, the aims could be really, really different. It could be to spread awareness about a scientific concept. It could be to make people enjoy something. It could be a game or an activity geared towards kids, where the sole aim is to make people enjoy it. It is not really learning a scientific concept of what is the DNA. It is just to get them more interested, right? Another aim could be to gauge interest and make people interested in some things. For example, if someone is not really very pro-science or very interested in science, the aim of the science writing or science communication could be to make someone interested or make them join a scientific career, maybe eventually. Another aim for science communication or storytelling could be to change opinions. So we live in an age where there is a lot of misinformation and a lot of fake news and a lot of anti-science sentiment. So people might be anti-climate change, people might be anti-vaccines. And the goal of storytelling or science communication can also be to change opinions of people. And lastly, sort of the larger goal of science communication is obviously fostering a better understanding of science, not just in terms of concepts and facts, but also the process and the method of science. And it could be to foster understanding of the scientific ecosystem also, right? So you can see that there can be many aims which are overlapping or can be discrete when it comes to storytelling. Now, I want you to remember that the sequence and the audience are different from scientific reports and stories, and we're going to come back to this later in the presentation today. Right. So we have talked about how science and stories are slightly different and have some similarities. But the bigger question is, why does science need stories? And I have said, why does science need stories, but also why does science communication need stories? And let me sort of present to you a few reasons why science does need stories. And I say science because science in general also needs stories, even when you're not doing psychom. All right. So stories of science are something that we all feel fascinated about, right? When we think of the discovery of the DNA or, the discovery of that the fact that the Earth revolves around the sun, or discovery of radioactivity, or most of the stories of science that we grew up with are sort of very fascinating. They have a lot of drama and tension in them, and they make for some really great stories, right? So scientists are also sort of bear witness to a lot of unprecedented stories. So stories of discovery, stories of curiosity, stories of solving a complex problem or putting together different pieces of a puzzle to kind of make sense of a natural phenomena around us are always going to be very, very fascinating. They're always going to evoke a lot of curiosity and interest. So stories of science are in general very, very interesting and have a lot of drama. As I said, stories of science are full of drama. There's a lot of twists and turns. There's a lot of things that happen. People fail. People sort of don't figure things out, and then they have a eureka moment, and then something happens, right? So a lot of stories of science that, especially that we grow up when we are kids and students, are sort of, we remember scientific concepts because of the stories associated with them, because of the stories of scientists who discovered the phenomena or the concept or the particle or the DNA or whatever it is. It's often the stories of scientists that really make us engaged and interested in the story of science. And lastly, science as a pursuit of knowledge is fertile for storytelling. As I said, there are a lot of ups and downs that happen in the process of science. There's a lot of failure. There's a lot of perseverance. There's always a hero that the scientist being the hero basically has to undergo a lot of challenges. And it's only when they have persevered for a really, really long time. And the long time can really be defined based on whether you're a PhD student or a scientist or an undergrad. So science as a pursuit of knowledge is also fertile for storytelling because there are lots of elements of storytelling which are right there embedded in the process of science. And we really need to be able to see that to sort of convert scientific studies and concepts and understandings into stories which are creative and compelling, right? The next reason that I want to sort of associate with science and storytelling is that stories really help you associate and connect better with your audience, right? So when you're talking to a scientist who is in the same field, say neuroscience, they understand and they have a background and a context and a motivation where they will be able to relate to what you're saying very easily. But when you're talking to a farmer or when you're talking to a student and when you're talking to a senior citizen, your connections really need to be reiterated a lot more. So stories are a really, really important way of connecting with your audience. Stories have always been a primary way of social bonding since human development, since times immemorial. Stories have always been a way that we communicate with each other. Language evolved as a way of storytelling. Um, Bridging differences of experiences and expertise and context. So when someone who does not belong to the same field, who does not have the same experiences or does not have the same kind of expertise as you, is in front of you and you're trying to communicate your science to them, it's very important that you're able to connect with them, and stories can be a good way of doing that. Stories also help humanize the objective scientists. Now, scientists really, the whole enterprise of science is based on the fact that you try to be objective, you try to be impartial, you try to be ethical. And while that is really, really important for the process of science, when it comes to communicating your science, it's very important to find an emotional connection with your audience. And so stories can be a great way of humanizing the objective scientist as a protagonist of the story, right? Here's a comic to sort of reiterate that point. So I'm just going to read it out in case it's not visible to anyone. So peer-reviewed papers are our bread and butter. They create knowledge and validate what we do. But our bread and butter can be difficult to digest too. It is so dense and so dry that no amount of chewing can make it tasty. I'm sure many of us who have read really, really complicated research papers can relate to this statement, right? That sometimes papers can be really dense to understand and it's difficult to make sense of it. By the time you read one line, you forget what the previous one was, right? So we chew tasteless bread because we have to, because it's our job, we have to be objective, but we can't be objective and tasty at the same time, right? Now, this dichotomy between being objective and tasty, or basically being accurate and being comprehensible or being interesting or creative, is a false dichotomy, which is something that I'll also come to later in my presentation. A lot of scientists think that doing psychom or using storytelling is basically the same thing as being sensationalist, right? Or hyping your study too much. And this is again something we'll come back to. But we can make our stories interesting with a secret ingredient called X. Now, X contains creativity, clarity, and narrative, right? Now, ingredient X makes readers want our bread and butter without compromising in its integrity. This way, the bread can be eaten, enjoyed, and digested. Yum. So that's a comic by Animate Your Science by Tullio Rossi. And the comic is basically there to tell you that it's very important to sort of balance creativity and clarity and narrative with objectivity and accuracy and scientific rigidity and validity. And that's all what today's presentation is about. How do you balance these two things, right? Right. So coming back to the reasons why stories are important to science, there are also a lot of cognitive factors involved when you're communicating your science. And as a neuroscience audience, you all are really, really equipped well to understand this better than me, but I'm just going to share a few points. The first thing is all of us, I'm sure we know about mirror neurons, and mirror neurons are really something that help us empathize, derive shared meaning, and process information better. It is one of the fundamental sort of developments in human neuroscience, which in human brain, sorry, which helped us sort of develop a lot of our human skills and competencies, right? So in order to appeal to mirror neurons, it's really, really important that you're able to use stories to sort of empathize and derive shared meaning with your audience better. Um, when you are using a story, you're also using multiple senses. There could be multisensory recall, and that aids comprehension and learning. And that's another reason for using stories. Oftentimes, there is a cognitive bias that we can really understand things that are at the human scale. When it comes to things that are at the microscopic scale or things which are at the astronomical scale, it becomes difficult for us to sort of conceptualize those things in our head. And it's difficult for us to understand scientific phenomena happening either at the quantum or microscopic scale or at the astronomical or celestial scale. And stories can be a great tool to sort of make science more understandable or more appealing or more sort of easy to digest when it comes to these skills which are not in the scale of human beings, right? I'm sure all of you know that there is a real issue with declining attention spans. We live in an age of digital sort of overload of information, and it can be very difficult to engage different people with content that you're trying to communicate to them and retain their attention spans, right? So stories, again, can be a great way of retaining attention spans in people. So these are some of the cognitive factors which tell us why stories are important for communicating science. The next reason that I want to sort of stress here is the reason behind building trust, right? Now, I think this is something I said when I was answering Sundatta's question also, that it's very easy to sort of break trust, but it takes a long, long time to build and retain trust, right? And we live in an age which is really polarized. Excuse me, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and it's very easy for people to sort of not trust or distrust science. And it's very, very important to use stories as a way of connecting with our audiences where we can retain and maintain trust with them, right? If you see a lot of news channels, they use a lot of hooks, which can be that they talk about some kind of conflict, they talk about something that's just novel or new, they talk about something that's happening very close to you. So if, for example, if they say that something is happening in Bangalore or Mumbai, you'll be more interested than if something is happening in New York or Washington, right? And then they talk about personal relevance. They really play to sort of the identities that we identified, whether it's religion, whether it's gender, whether it's caste, so on and so forth. So a lot of these things are used by media channels as hooks to kind of engage the audiences. But there is also an ethical element to using these hooks, that they can also be misused very easily. And that really jeopardizes the trust we have in science as a larger enterprise and ecosystem. And that is exactly where stories come into play, because these media channels, often when they are spreading misinformation, they use a lot of these stories and hooks to very, very effectively. And that is why it's so difficult to fight misinformation. But as scientists who are trying to communicate the right information, we also need to be able to use these stories and hooks in an ethical but meaningful way to engage with our audiences, right? And we'll talk about this, as I said, the ethical usage aspect. And in general, it's important to build science-society relationships in the long term also. A more sort of practical reason for using stories is a stronger professional impact. So if you're using approaches from storytelling, if you're using tips and tricks from storytelling, it can also enable you to make a stronger professional impact. For example, it can help you write more impactful papers. It can help you deliver more engaging presentations, prepare more compelling reports and proposals, convince prospective employers, influence policymakers, and in general, change public opinion on the large and long-term scale, right? So there are more obvious and practical reasons also for using stories. Now, can we pause for a minute, and can everybody type in the chat box some reasons, maybe in less than a line, just a phrase or just a few keywords about why do you do science? What's the reason, or what's your motivation for doing science, or what convinced you or motivated you to do science? Can we pause for a minute and write in the chat box what made you do science? Okay, the thrill to find the unknown, Nishta says. Latish says, it's mysterious and fascinating. Shushti says, stories are motivation to do science. Divya says, to explore new things. Jilika says, following my curiosity. Devendra says, I love science. Alok says, curiosity. Dushyant says, knowledge. Still not unknown, learning about life, intrigues. Okay, I'm flooded. There is joy in finding about the world around me. Science fascinates me in every aspect. To find easier ways to explain my brain. All right, great. Okay, unveiling life's mystery. That's great. All right, so I'm going to go back to my presentation and let me know if you can't see those slides. All right. So as you all sort of shared right now, and a lot of these points that I'm going to cover will all be covered by you, stories can also be a great way of introspecting personally, right? So stories can help scientists articulate better why they became scientists, why are they interested in their field, why is their work important, their personal and professional motivations. And this could be a very important tool to sort of not just fight imposter syndrome and sort of do better, but also to sort of have a bigger or larger or a bird's eye view of why is it that you're doing science and how do you decide what's the next step that you want to take in your scientific career, right? So it's always also important to come back to your own story of why you want to do science, and that is another important reason why stories are integral to the process of doing science effectively, right? And also, again, as I said, stories help you focus on the process of science also. Right. So the last reason that I want to sort of focus on before moving on to the next section is that stories can also be a tool of making academia more diverse, inclusive, and efficient. And this is something that I really sort of feel very strongly about. So here are a few points. So stories can help other students who may not feel that they are capable of doing science. It can inspire them to join science if you are putting up a good example. Stories can be positive representation for marginalized communities, especially whether it's women in science, whether it's Dalit people, whether it's trans people, whether it's LGBTQI minorities. Stories of people who are already in science and who belong to marginalized communities can be a very important tool for encouraging more people to join science and to make them feel more included being a part of science, especially when we live in a day and age where everything is so polarized. Um, Stories can also be a way of sharing what's happening with you in science, and I'm sure all of you can relate with this. It can be a great way of raising awareness about systemic issues in science, right? I think the Life of Science and many other organizations that we see around us are doing a great job of talking about stories of people in science, and that may not be explaining any scientific concept or doing psychom in the conventional sense, but it is doing a much more important job of making experiences and expertises in science more relatable, and sharing the stories of people and what they went through to get to the point where they are. And it really humanizes the protagonist, the scientist better. And it can be really encouraging for people, especially students and people from minority communities, to sort of feel more included in science. Stories can also be a great way of embracing failures and negative results. And this is something that we don't do often enough in academia, that we don't talk about failures and negative results, but talking about failures and negative results can be a great way of understanding the process of science better, a great way of understanding that what were the challenges that had to be overcome to reach a result. And it can make the final result be much more appreciated and much more sort of useful and valid in the end if you share some stories of failure and negative results also. Lastly, stories can be a great way of fighting imposter syndrome and mental health issues. And I'm sure as a neuroscience audience, you appreciate this more than anyone else. So I don't need to say anything further on this. And lastly, stories can be a great way of being positive role models, as I said before. So these are some of the reasons or some of the motivations why I think stories are very important, both as part of science as well as science communication. And today, the rest of the presentation on my workshop today is basically going to focus on how can we integrate these stories that are already present in science, which are already an integral part of science, and make them shine, make them come out better, make them emerge, make them sort of shine a little bit more when you're doing science communication. And how can this be used more effectively, right? Now, before I proceed, I just want to pause for a moment and ask, is there anything that anybody wants to ask? Anything that was not clear? Did I go too fast on anything? Anything that you guys want to ask? Please feel free to unmute and ask me. Yes, Tarun, I completely agree. Dunning-Kruger effect is something that a lot of us also face, and imposter syndrome also, and it can be a great way to sort of make yourself feel more included in the process of science and in academia. All right, any questions at this point? Anything that you want me to sort of reiterate or go back to? All right, please feel free to interrupt me at any point. I'm just going to go ahead then. Right. So we have looked at why stories are important and are an integral part of science, but let us look at a little bit of theory or concepts in terms of storytelling, and we'll come back to how we can use these principles of storytelling in our science communication and science writing towards the later half of the presentation. All right. So let's take an example. So you have been asked to give a presentation, say, to a school audience, say an audience of maybe 15 to 18-year-olds, and or maybe a presentation in your department. And so you have to tell them a story. How do you avoid the standard boring presentation, right? A presentation is coming up. Which kind of presentation are you going to give? You can give the standard list-like presentation where you list everything. So you say, hello, my name is Dr. Smart, and I do research on XYZ. Then you say, this is my first graph, and this is my second graph, and that's my third graph, and that's my last graph. And these are my conclusions. And then you end the presentation. Now, when you do this, what happens is that a lot of times people who are really interested in your work, who might be people who are your supervisors, who are people from your lab, will listen because they already have interest in your work. But people who may not be from your lab, or maybe from another department, or maybe from not from neuroscience, or maybe from a physics or chemistry background, or may not be in science at all, they might often fall asleep and they might be bored, right? So this type of presentation is basically called an and presentation, where you just keep giving a list of things. It can be a boring list of facts. It does not tell a story. There is no drama. There is no narrative structure. And this is perhaps not the most ideal way of giving a presentation. Now let's look at an alternative way of giving a presentation, right? So you say, hello, my name is Dr. Super Smart, and today I'm going to tell you a story. Then you say, we knew this and that, but we really didn't understand how this worked. Therefore, we did this experiment and found that this is important because XYZ, and then we did this, but we did not understand this further. Therefore, we did something else, and that's how we understood this, right? Now, what's the difference here? This is an and, but, therefore type of presentation, right? Where you're sharing some facts, there is a little bit of listing of facts involved, but there is a drama element where when you say, but we did not understand this, right? Now that but itself is a way that intrigues the audience to listen to you more carefully. It adds an element of drama into your thing, and it's not even sensationalizing your story, because there is always a but in science, because we don't understand a lot of things, right? And when you say a but and then you sort of explain how you solve that problem, you're basically creating a conflict resolution pair in your storytelling or in your presentation, which is a natural way of intriguing the human mind, which is a natural way of making people interested. And in basic words, it's basically a story. It's a narrative. It's an element of the story which comes in, and basically your presentation then has narrative structure. Now, because of this and, but, and therefore, your presentation becomes much more engaging. You know, this comic was made by Dr. Andy Olson, and you can look up his work online. So coming back to narrative structures, right? So this and, but, therefore thing is something which is a very basic element of storytelling, but it is one of the most fundamental sort of elements of storytelling, which you can use almost everywhere and anywhere, right? So this and, but, therefore forms the basic building blocks of any narrative. And can also be called agreement, but can be called contradiction, and therefore can be called consequence. You can also call it as setup, problem, and solution action. You can also call it a conflict resolution pair. It doesn't matter what term you use. The idea is that you list something, you add a but or a however or a irrespective of that, or something which basically is a contradictory word, and then you put a therefore in the end, which basically solves the problem, right? So conflict resolution pairs, as I said, is fundamental to every story. And this ABT and but therefore structure is all around us. If you look at any film, any book, any television, any famous speech by any person, any ad, any journalism, it is all around us, right? If you look at any play by Shakespeare, if you look at any movie for that matter, there is always an and but therefore. If you look at any famous speech also, you're going to find this everywhere, right? Right. So another way of looking at this and but therefore structure is called the narrative spectrum. And this is a visual way of sharing the same concept that I shared earlier. And here's a diagram to explain it, right? So when you have an and presentation, the sort of the narrative spectrum is basically a straight line, which does not curve or a lot. When you have an and but therefore, there are waves of narratives on the narrative spectrum, which you can see makes it more interesting. It makes it more narrative. But if you have too many despites, however, buts yet, then it becomes very confusing, right? So there has to be a good balance between the and the but to make your narrative ideally compelling and interesting, right? Now, there's another way of measuring this. This is a very crude way of measuring this, and of course, this is not foolproof. There are exceptions everywhere, but it's a good way to start and look at different kinds of texts that are around you to see what's sort of the narrative index that they have, right? Now, narrative index is nothing but the number of buts divided by the number of ands multiplied by 100. So it's basically a percentage. And the buts can also, you can also expand the number of buts if there are not enough buts. You can also think of however, despite, yet, although, instead, while. But usually the number of but is a good estimate because that's the most common word used to include drama or contradiction in any story or any piece of writing, right? Now, before the presentation today, I don't know if the Mind Gala team were able to share this. I had asked everyone to get a scientific paper and a popular science article. Was that something that you all were able to do? No worries if not. I just want to check. Could anyone from the Mind Gala team just let me know if this was communicated? All right. So everybody has got a scientific paper and a storytelling thing, right? So if you can open that in a separate tab on your computer, what I want you to do is just go to the scientific paper first and do a control F, basically do a search and just write the word but and see how many buts are there, right? And then you do the same thing for and you just calculate the narrative index based on the formula that is there on the slide. And can you share it on the chat box? So number of buts divided by number of ands into 100. Can you share the percentage for the scientific paper and the popular science article? I just want to do a quick activity to see if there's any difference between these two forms of science writing, which is a scientific paper and a popular science article. And if you can share both of this in the chat, I'll give you 2 minutes to do this. That'll be great. You can just use the search feature on your computer. I think it should not take more than a couple of minutes. You don't have to manually count them. Mukarram is asking how to see many but are there in some research papers. Just do a control F or whatever the find or search feature is in your Mac or your Windows system. And if you type the word but, you should be able to see how many search results come up. So let me show it to you actually. I think that might help. So I'm just going to open. Can you see my screen? So if you just do the control F and you write but at the top, you should be able to calculate it. Was everybody able to get it? Okay, so Shrishti says it's about 4% for both. Research article Nishta says is 8.7 and popular article is 17. Okay, that's almost more than double of that. That's interesting. Anybody else? Nitya Shri says paper was 3.5% and article was 22%. Great. So you can already see there is a stark difference between the narrative index of a scientific paper versus a popular science article. Popular article is 18, paper is 3.8, 4.8 and 15 for popular science. All right. So, all right, Kunal says popular science article was 14%, science paper was 9%. So you can see that mostly scientific papers are below 10 or 12 and popular science articles are more than that. So that's okay. It's okay if everybody was not able to do it. I just wanted to see some examples. All right. So here are a few more examples that I sort of looked up last night. So this is the machine learning paper and narrative index for this was, there were 7 buts and 54 ands, so the narrative index was basically 12.9%, which I think is not that great, but it's expected because it's a technical machine learning paper. If you look at the discovery of DNA paper by Watson and Crick, the narrative index is 24.1%. And this is a trend that I have observed. And I mean, I'm not saying that I have studied this, but usually the papers that were written before the 1980s or 1970s were much more narrative, were much more interesting, were much more sort of well written and had a much more higher element of narrative and storytelling than the papers written today. And I think that's something to reflect on also. So the DNA paper was actually much better than the machine learning paper, and it was 24%, which was higher than most of the things that we saw today. If you look at Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, the narrative index is 33%, which is really, really high, and it's quite expected because it's Shakespeare. But the last example that I want to show you is this article called War in the Womb, which is by Suzanne Sadarin, and it's one of my favorite pieces of science writing, or popular science writing, I should say. And the narrative index of this piece was 44%, which is incredibly high. And I'm sharing this example here because I want to encourage all of you that science writing does not have to be dry. It can actually be really, really interesting. It can be even higher. It can have a higher narrative index than Romeo and Juliet too. So don't give up hope. And if you write well, you can actually get narrative index higher. That being said, the narrative index is not the end all of everything. It's just one amongst many other tools to sort of look at your writing. But there are many other ways of evaluating your writing, and we'll come to that today. But I think this could be an interesting tool as a first snapshot of a piece of writing. You can do this very quickly and see how narrative the piece of writing is. And I should also mention that there are books on the ABT structure. There are books on using narrative indexes and structures that you can look up on Google and read more about if you're interested. All right, so I'll move on from that. So the first concept was narrative index or narrative spectrum. The second concept that I want to talk about today is narrative arc or a plot diagram. Now, plot diagrams are basically a series of events structured to ensure drama. And we saw a little bit of this when we talked about sequence at the beginning of the presentation, and we looked at the elements of stories and scientific reports. But let's come back to this in a little bit more detail, right? So most narrative arcs are based on a hero or a character's journey, and they help facilitate empathy, emotions, and engagement. And the basic mantra of storytelling is to unfold it gradually instead of dumping it all together, right? So as opposed to a scientific paper where you write what the entire paper is about in your abstract, in storytelling, it's very important to sort of build up the story and to unfold it gradually and to have that sense of mystery or suspense. I mean, it doesn't have to be suspense per se all the time, but it's important to sort of unfold your story in a way that takes the audience on a journey with you, where they understand the science more gradually, but they're also invested in the story of the protagonist or the scientist or the researcher in a way that they're invested in the story, right? So it's very important to formulate a story where you're unfolding it gradually rather than dumping all the information together, right? Now let's look at an example of a narrative arc. Right. So most of the storytelling examples, whether it's Shakespeare, whether it's any film, whether it's any book, follow something called the 3-act structure, or sort of, in this case, it's a 5-act structure, but you can also call it a 3-act structure. So the first part of a story is basically the exposition. And I don't want you to worry about these terms too much, but I'm just sharing these because these are technical terms used in the storytelling sort of field. So the exposition is basically the introduction to a story, its characters, the context, the mood, the time, the background. So whenever you see a movie or read a book, the first few minutes or chapters of the book are basically devoted to talking about who the characters are, what period or age the book or the film is set in, what's happening around the character, and what's the background, what's the motivation. So basically, context setting is what exposition is. The second part, and you can see that the graph is rising here, is conflict. Now, this character, once you have introduced the character and the background and the motivation and the context, there is usually a conflict that comes in the story, which is the primary problem which drives the story, which is the point of the story, right? Now, after the conflict has been introduced, the conflict gets more complicated, and there is a sense of rising action where all the events basically lead to an eventual climax, right? And this is, again, any movie, any book you read, this structure is there. I mean, it's very easy to spot it. The climax is basically the peak of the story in terms of excitement. It's an inflection point after which things start getting sorted out and revealed more gradually, right? Now, after the rising action, sorry, was there a question? All right. So after the climax, there's basically the stories, the tension in the story starts falling a little bit. So it's called falling action. And that's where basically the plot points and the questions that have been raised in the first half of the story are basically wrapped up and answered, right? So this is a falling action. And the last is basically the resolution, where the story has a conclusion, whether it's a sad, happy, or abstract conclusion. But the story basically reaches a natural conclusion where everything is all well and things go back to as they were, or they go back to another level where things proceed. And then either it's a happily live after or it's a sad ending. It doesn't matter, right? Now, if you look at a 3-act structure in most Shakespeare's play, the same structure is basically called prostasis, epistasis, and catastrophe, right? And there can be different terms or names for calling this, but basically what happens is that there is a graph that goes top to the climax, and then it falls, and then it reaches a natural conclusion. Right. Now, another way of looking at the narrative arc could be to follow a hero's journey, right? Now, let's look at the example of Harry Potter, right? Now, there is a call to adventure. So, Harry is living in the Muggle world. It's an ordinary world. There's a call to adventure, which is basically the letter from Hogwarts. And there is refusal from his Muggle uncle and aunt to not let him go. And then there is a mentor or a helper, which is basically when Hagrid comes along and helps Harry go to Hogwarts. And then Harry crosses the threshold, which is the platform 9 by 3/4. And then Harry is faced with a lot of tests and allies and enemies, and there are lots of other characters which are revealed at Hogwarts. And eventually, after most of the movie is in the last third of the movie, you basically reach an ordeal, right? Which is basically the Sorcerer's Stone, and in this case, and then there is a fight with the villain of the story, and there's a reward at the end. And then basically there is a wrapping up of the story where the road back, and there is atonement, and there is return back to the Muggle world, right? Now, this is again, I'm just using the example of Harry Potter because it's something that most of us are familiar with. But you can see that this is also a very similar thing to the narrative structure or arc that we saw in the previous slide, which is a call to adventure, a supreme ordeal or initiation. Then there is an unification or transformation, and then there's a hero's return or a road back to the initial home, right? Now, again, why am I sharing all of this with you? Because it's not important to try and fit your scientific paper or your scientific presentation or your scientific sort of journey within these sort of discrete entities or steps. The idea is to understand how the story is kind of going on, what is sort of the journey in which the hero or the protagonist is moving, and try to find similar examples or similar protagonists within our scientific stories to be able to use those protagonists as the central characters when we are telling a story, right? So when you're writing a scientific paper, often the aim is to present the fact and evidence, and you're talking about how you did the experiments and how you got the results and what were your conclusions and what were your discussion points, right? But when you're telling a story, oftentimes it's important to talk about your own personal journey while doing the research, the failures that you had, the kind of things that led you to become aware of the problem. What was the sort of the motivation for doing this study? There are so many things that you may not include in a scientific paper, but that could really be storytelling gold when it comes to doing science communication or science writing, right? So the reason I'm sharing all these concepts in storytelling is that it's to sort of make you more aware that there are lots of elements of the story that are suppressed when you're writing a scientific report, but which need to be picked up and highlighted and polished and presented when you are doing a SciComm activity or a science writing activity, right? So I hope that came across in what I was sharing so far. All right, so now let's take a break and let's do a small activity. I had asked everyone to get an A4 sheet, and you can also use a notepad or any piece of paper that you have around you. You can also use your laptop if that helps. What I want you to do is basically draw 6 boxes on the sheet of paper with a pencil or a pen. And in each of the boxes, I want you to either draw something visually, or I want you to write one sentence or a few phrases or maybe 3 bullet points. Like, keep it as short or as minimal as you can, but I want you to jot down certain points or a quick sketch in each of these 6 boxes in terms of any research story that is close to you. It could be a research story that is based on your PhD research or your master's research or your undergrad summer project. It could be a paper that you read, or it could be something that you are interested in communicating to the audience. It doesn't matter what example you pick. I just want you to take up one scientific concept or story or project and write down in these 6 boxes what was the exposition, which is the introduction to the concept, the conflict or what is the problem in the story, where is the rising action towards the climax, what is the climax, what's the falling action, and what's the resolution. Is the activity clear to everyone? Any questions?
It's clear.
All right, great. So let's take, it's 1:25. So let's take 10 minutes to do this because I also want to wrap up by 1:45. So I think let's take exactly 10 minutes to do this. And what should be in exposition? Exposition is basically sort of the introduction to the central characters, the theme, the story, the context of the story. So, for example, if you're talking about a research, say a cancer paper, right? The exposition could be that cancer is a disease which is really troubling people, and we wanted to study this particular aspect of cancer. So you're basically introducing the background or the context or the motivation or the foundation of the story, which is what your audience needs to know for them to be able to go on a journey with you to understand what your research paper did, right? So what's the background information that the audience will need for you to sort of understand the story, right? I'll share the slide again. Yeah. And I'm not sure if you will be able to share this with me right now, but my social media handle is also there on the slide. So if you would like some feedback on this, you're very welcome to share this with me on LinkedIn or Twitter, and I can get back to you later after the session today, maybe, but not during the session right now. Right. So I'm going to switch off my video for 5 minutes and let you focus on this. And if there's any question, just type it in the chat box and I'll answer.
Hi, Siddharth. Can you stop sharing? If you want to open Gmail, because we can still see that.
Is that okay?
Yeah, that's better.
Sure.
Siddharth, people are requesting for a slide to be put on in this time, so they can keep looking at it.
Anyways, I have shared the headings in the chat box, if that helps.
Siddharth is not here.
Sorry, I missed seeing this. Right. So rising action is basically a point of conflict where it could either be some sort of a problem that you faced, or it could be a challenge which has been unsolved in science. It could be kind of a problem that's plaguing society. It could be anything. It really depends on the story. So if you tell me a little bit more about the story, maybe I can help you with that. If we want to write a simple research paper on any kind of retrospective study, right. So does anybody have any more questions at this point? Any trouble that you're facing or anything you want to ask, you want to discuss? So Svikrit is asking, perfection is the enemy of good. What's the right amount of time to spend preparing a story for, say, a 30-minute presentation? It really depends on what the intent is with the presentation. If it's a talk to your peers, then maybe an hour or two is good. If it's a talk to a bunch of school students, I think you'll need to devote a lot more time. So it really depends on the audience, the shared context. What is their level of expertise or understanding of the neuroscience that you might be talking about. If you're talking to a series of patients with neurodegenerative disorders, I think it's a very, very different approach to the kind to in terms of the story that you might be using. So I would say that it really, really depends on who your audience is, what are you trying to communicate, and what do you want to achieve out of it, right? So yeah. Sorry, I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but all right. So I think we'll move on now. You everybody can continue doing this, and we can. I'm very happy to chat offline to sort of discuss this. I want to before I proceed, I do want to say at this point that I understand it's not easy to translate your scientific paper into a story, especially when it's within these boxes that I just shared. And I think one of the reasons I wanted to make everybody do this activity was also to share that it's not always easy to find a story out of your science, but there are lots of things that you can do to sort of make your science more interesting, right? So one of the things that I think I spoke before was to talk about your failure, is to talk about your own journey within the process of science and how did you. So instead of just focusing on the science and what the research literature review in the field is and what you added to it, which is very dry, if you can share that I am someone who comes from so and so background and I wanted to understand this better because I know someone who has this neurodegenerative disorder, and this is something that I tried, but I had so many setbacks in my lab and I failed. This experiment didn't work. I was trying to work with mice, but it didn't work. Then I wanted to work with monkeys. I mean, I'm just saying this offhand. I don't know anything about neuroscience. But my point is that if you can share a little bit of the process that you underwent. So what I want to reiterate here is that it's very important to think of your own story in science, your own journey in science is perhaps one of the most easiest way to convert a scientific concept into a story, right? Is to share your own personal journey in science in terms of how you learned that science, how you discovered that science, how you built up that science, right? And that is one of the easiest way to make people connect with you better, because even if they are not scientists, they can connect with the challenges and the ups and downs that you went through. And I think it's very human to start associating ourselves with the person in front. If they also become more human, which is when they face failures and they face setbacks and how they overcome them, that's a fundamentally human thing, right? To sort of have challenges and figure out a way to solve them, right? So use these sort of cognitive sort of factors in terms of making your science more appealing, more palatable, even if you're not able to find an entire plot with exposition, rising action, climax, everything. It's okay if you don't find all of that. That's not to say that that's the only way of doing storytelling, but it's important to find stories within our own experiences to kind of share and to share them in a way which makes it meaningful to the audience also. Right. All right. So I'm going to share my screen again, and I have a few more slides before we finish. Right. Just let me know if you're able to see my screen. All right. Okay. So after we have done this, so does anybody have any reflections on doing this activity before I proceed? Any challenges or any issues that you faced? Anybody wants to share anything? Yes, Mukaram. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Hi, do you want to come on screen and say, ask your question? I don't know how to pronounce. It's Mukaram Bhatt. Are you speaking? I
Yeah, you're audible.
Okay. Somehow he's not audible to us, but if you can
Yes.
hear him, you may repeat his
Okay,
questions.
Mukarram, I'll come back. I'll repeat your question towards the end of the talk and come back. Okay, I think I should. There's not much time left, so I'm sorry. I'll just come back to your question in the end. Is that okay? All right. Thank you. Yeah. All right. So now that we have sort of engaged a little bit with the principles of storytelling, let us look at some storytelling hacks for science writing and some things that can help us make our science more story-like or make it more appealing. The first thing I want to sort of reiterate again and again is to know your audience. It is very, very important to understand who your audience is, what their background is, what's in it for them to engage with you. So understand their background and context, whether they're a student, whether they are a patient, whether they are a senior citizen, whether they are your peers or your lab members. If you understand the audience and their background and context, it can really, really help you formulate your story, which is more meaningful, which is more attuned, which is more sort of calibrated to their needs and expectations. And I think it's very important to do that. The second thing that you can do is to try to step into their shoes and identify what specific interests or motivations they might have, right? What's in it for them to engage with you, your science communication output, your science writing, your storytelling, whatever it is, right? You need to put yourselves into their shoes and understand what's in it for them to sort of, engage with you. What are they getting out of it? Are you helping them in any way? Are you increasing their learning? Are you increasing their interest? Are you increasing? So basically go back to the aims and purpose and goals of your science communication or science writing and try to understand their interests and motivations also, right? Basically, once you understand the background, the context, the interest, motivation, you can tailor your story and details accordingly. And don't forget the 3 C's of storytelling, which is content, context, and connect, which I also mentioned in the beginning. The next thing that you can do to make your storytelling more appealing is signposting, right? So signposts are basically sort of periodic reminders of what you're talking about, providing a larger context of why your story is important. And you need to do this multiple times and you need to reiterate the same concept maybe a couple of times within your story or your science presentation to be able to make the audience relate to it and not forget the bigger picture, right? So add signposts to your stories. Benchmarks in scientific journeys. So basically, you did this experiment and then you failed, and then you did this, and then you submitted this paper where it was rejected, and the reviewers came back with certain comments. So these are benchmarks in scientific journey, which we don't usually talk about in our scientific talks and papers. But I think they can be great storytelling elements also because they very, very naturally add elements of storytelling and elements of tension, elements of drama into your stories. So benchmarks in scientific journey can also be a great way of signposting where your story is going and where your story is going to be headed eventually. Ignorance by the characters is a great narrative element. So ignorance basically, so you know that you're talking about a bigger picture. Your audience knows you're talking about something that you're trying to solve. But in the story, if you have a character or protagonist that you're using, you can make that protagonist not be aware of what the eventual outcome is, right? So using ignorance of the characters within the story can be a great way to make the audience go from a point where the character does not know anything to the character understanding and appreciating the science. Could be a very natural way of taking the audience on a trajectory of scientific understanding from there to here, right? So ignorance of the characters can also be a great element. Basically, take them on a journey, right? So signpost and tell them, like, if you remember at the beginning of my talk, I said that these are the things we're going to be covering, right? And after every few slides, I have a big slide which says that this is the next section, right? So adding these signposts within throughout your presentation or throughout your writing is very important, and it can help audiences make sense of all the information that you're throwing at them by being able to see the larger picture. Keep the story moving, right? Now, can someone tell me what is this? Any guesses? You'll have to unmute yourself and say, because I can't see the chat box.
Disc florets.
Right. So these are florets of sunflower, but it's not obvious when you look at the picture that it is a sunflower. So the moral of showing these two pictures is that sometimes you need to step away from the details and look at the bigger picture. And I think when you're communicating science to a non-expert audience who are not trained in scientific disciplines, it's very, very important to present the bigger picture before you go into the details, right? Oftentimes in scientific papers, we kind of go into the details in the results section very, very quickly without really taking time to go sort of build up to it. So the moral is that you have to present the bigger picture also, right? So contextualize the bigger picture. Cherry pick your anecdotes, right? So sometimes in a scientific story, there are lots of details which are very important to you. But in terms of storytelling, you don't need to communicate each and every aspect of your scientific journey or story. Sometimes you need to cherry pick your anecdotes. I know you should not cherry pick your data, but when it comes to science communication, you can cherry pick your anecdotes and you select the best anecdotes which sort of communicate the most important and exciting aspects of your science to the audience. The idea is not to be comprehensive in terms of telling them every single detail. The idea is to choose the best and most engaging aspects of your scientific journey or story and communicate it in a way in which it's engaging, right? And don't forget the and but therefore structure while you do this, right? Non-linear timelines, right? Sometimes when we're communicating science, we go from the beginning till the end, right? And sometimes that may not be as exciting for the audience as it is for a scientific audience, right? So sometimes you need to be able to use a non-linear timeline, which means that you go back and forth. So you can say that this researcher is working on something, another research maybe 50 years before was working on something else, and then you come back to the present day and then you show connections. So you can play with the chronology of events in your story also to sometimes bring out the exciting aspects more clearly sometimes, right? So it doesn't always have to be a linear chronology or timeline. Harmonic oscillations between the storytelling and the science. I think this is something which is really important. So when you are communicating science, it's very easy to sort of bulk up all the explaining the scientific jargon and content at the beginning of the story and then talking about the results at the end. But what you need to do is sometimes you need to draw in the audience, make them interested in your story, then share a little bit of the science and then go back to the larger sort of story and then explain a little bit more of the science. So you need to be able to harmonically oscillate between the storytelling and the science both for it to be an effective narrative and for your audience to not get overwhelmed by all the scientific jargon, right? So use harmonic oscillations, oscillate between the storytelling and the science in a way in which it is digestible and palatable, okay? Slaying the jargon dragon. I think this is something that most of us really struggle with. And here's a comic that I'm going to read out in case it's not visible. So the professor here is saying, that's an interesting question. Certainly, precise determination of current temporal state is of utmost practical importance. While it is not possible to provide definitive answers within the present context, future work will ... And then the old lady says, yeah, you mean you don't know the time, right? So it's very important to not use a lot of jargon. And oftentimes as scientists, we don't realize how much scientific jargon we use when we're talking because we're so used to using those scientific terms. But when you're talking to a student or a senior citizen or a patient, they may actually not be aware of scientific jargon. So for example, a word like cell, right? When you say cell, you think of a plant or an animal cell, right? But to a lay audience or a non-expert audience, a cell could mean a prison, right? So it's very important to sort of be careful about what terms you're using and to sort of explain and simplify those terms as and when necessary, right? So use everyday language as much as possible. Explore complex ideas. So don't be afraid of exploring complex scientific concepts or ideas, but you need to let go of the complexity. What do you mean by let go of the complexity? It means that you need to build up the complexity gradually. You explain. So if you're explaining, say, a DNA gel electrophoresis, right? You start by explaining what is a DNA. Most people have heard of DNA, but they not understand. But it's still important to sort of add like a phrase to explain what is DNA, and then you build that DNA can be separated electrophorically, and then you explain what is a gel electrophoretic setup, right? So it's important to let go of the complexity gradually. So you add layers of complexity throughout your story. So that's another technique that you can use. Always expand abbreviations. Abbreviations like lots of things that we use in science are obvious to us, but it may not be obvious to a non-expert audience. Proofread and edit ruthlessly, right? Sometimes we don't realize we're using jargon, but when you proofread and edit your writing ruthlessly, you can spot a lot of these things. And there are online tools like the de-jargonizer tool or the Flash Kincaid readability test that you can use online, and it gives you a sense of how much jargon is there in your piece of writing. And I would encourage you to use this and explore these further. I'm not going to go into the details of these things, but it's something that you guys can look up. All right. So in terms of simplifying jargon, a very important tool is to use hooks. And hooks can grab our attention and appeal to us emotionally. Examples of hooks can include images, videos, diagrams. It can be quotes, it can be questions, it can be analogies, anecdotes, games, wordplay, humor, interactive websites. I mean, the list is really long. But the idea is to also use hooks without being sensationalist or using hyperbolic language, right? So oftentimes in newspapers, when you read science journalism, not anymore maybe, but maybe 10, 15 years ago, there used to be things like, oh, this is going to eating chocolate will, cure cancer. And then the next day there'll be like, eating chocolate causes cancer, right? So it's important to use hooks to grab your audience's attention, to make them interested in your story or your writing. But it's also important to use them more ethically and more responsibly. Here's a cartoon by XKCD, which is a great example. So when you see a claim that a common drug or vitamin kills cancer cells in a petri dish, keep in mind, so does a handgun, right? So it's important to not go overboard with hooks and use them responsibly. The idea is that when you use a hook and you're promising your audience or your reader something that's going to happen during your presentation, you must fulfill that promise in the course of your writing or your science communication activity, right? So I think that's an easy test to see whether your hook is sensationalist or not, is that whether you're actually fulfilling that claim that you made in the beginning of your talk or your writing towards the end of your talk, right? Right. So one of the last things that I want to talk about is metaphors and analogies, which is basically saying using things that around us which make a lot more sense to people and could be an easy way for understanding complex scientific concepts. A very interesting example is water system and electric circuit. Now we are all aware that a pipe system of water delivery has words like pipe, pump, water, pressure, narrowness, flow. And these were co-opted in the 1930s and 40s when electricity became a household phenomenon. We also co-opted these terms in terms of wire, battery, electricity, voltage, resistance. And you can see that our understanding of how electricity works, even though it's wrong, actually, the metaphor is actually wrong because electricity flows in the other direction. It is very, very much dominated by the metaphor of a pipe system of water, right? And this could be a powerful tool to explain your science, but it can also go wrong equally easily, right? So you need to be careful about when you're talking about the flow of current. You have to understand that there are limitations to using metaphors and analogies. So you need to use metaphors and analogies in a way where they make sense, but you also need to state the caveats or the limitations of using those metaphors and analogies. This comic is by Matthew Farinella and one of my favorite sort of science illustrators. And I think it's really interesting. So one more thing that he also drew is that in conclusion, just like microscopes, metaphors enable scientists to visualize the invisible, bringing into focus useful details while blurring others, right? So when you're using a metaphor analogy, it's not that you are misleading the audience or you're not sharing certain things. You're just focusing on certain aspects of the scientific concept or story while blurring out the rest of it. And for that moment in time when you're reading or writing or engaging someone with the scientific concept, it's useful to forget the bigger picture and just focus on one detail and then move on to the other thing. And then you Lego up the complexity gradually, all right? The last thing that I want to talk about is balancing accuracy and accessibility. This is something that every science communicator worth their grain of salt has struggled with. And I think a lot of scientists and students also struggle with this, that oftentimes making your science communication writing or output more accessible, more interesting, more creative, more sort of appealing comes at the cost of accuracy, right? Or vice versa. If you make it too accessible and interesting, the scientific accuracy goes away, right? So how do you balance accuracy and accessibility? I think that is something that nobody has an answer to, but it's something that we all need to sort of wrestle with from time to time. And my 2 cents on this aspect is to basically aim for a representation of the truth that draws people in, but does not mislead them. So as long as your depiction or your science communication output is not misleading people or telling them the wrong concept of science, it's okay to leave out certain details. It's not important. They don't need to understand the scientific concept as well as you do, because you're a scientist and you have to engage with those scientific concepts much more deeply than they have to. For their sake of understanding, it's okay to have a slightly more superficial understanding of the concept, but as long as you're not misleading them and they have access to resources where they can read up more if they want to, right? Another way to look at it is to distill the scientific concept into simple words, but not distort the science. It's another way of saying the same thing. A good example to think of in this case is maps, right? When you look at maps, when you look at a map of India, say it's a map of, I would say, grains that are grown in India, right? You will have maps which are differently shaded or colored to show different types of grains and cereals that are grown in India. But at the same time, that map will not have a topography or the climate sort of access and all of that, right? So in any map, you're always leaving out 90% of the information, but you're only selectively focusing on 10% of the information, right? But maps, and that is understood by the audience, that you are leaving out a lot of information to focus on one aspect of the country, of the geography, of the terrain, and that is an understood understanding between your audience and you. And I think maps are a great way of analogy of thinking of how to do SciComm in a way where you are sharing only certain aspects of SciComm or scientific concepts with, and leaving out rest of it. Games are another way of looking at it, where they build up complexity. If you've played any sort of user sort of game online or a video game or something, you see that they usually build up complexity gradually, right? It starts with a simpler level and then the complexity keeps building up, right? So maps and games are both useful sort of approaches to think of your SciComm in terms of, and I'll leave you with that. So one more thing that I want to add before I finish is the yin yang of SciComm. So the current culture of science is based on being accurate, being non-emotive, being formal, objective, impersonal, concise. And the opposite culture of that is basically being entertaining, concise, sensationalist, oversimplified, hyperbolic. Effective or engaging SciComm is basically a good balance or a good yin yang of both these cultures, where you're accurate, objective, concise, clear, but you're also absorbable, inspiring, original, accessible, right? So the entirety of SciComm is basically finding a good balance between accuracy and accessibility. And that's my sort of my parting message for you. Before I leave, I also want to leave you with two more things. So one is a new definition for SciComm. I really like this definition in terms of storytelling. So SciComm, I mean, Shreya and Sundar have shared many definitions, but I want to add one more definition, which is that SciComm is a process of distilling the most salient information from a complex body of work into the most concise and compelling story possible for a given audience, right? Now, focus on the words distilling, where how you distill, what you distill really depends on the audience. And what is concise and compelling story for a senior citizen versus a student versus a patient can all be very different, right? So it's all about adapting your story to your audience, to the context, and making them engage with your content, right? So coming back to the 3 C's: content, connect, and context. Remember those things. Before I go, here's a thought to some food for thought for you to think about. The plural of anecdote is not data. This is something that we all hear about when we're learning science. But I want to leave you with a question, which is, can the plural of anecdotes be engaging SciComm? And I don't know the answer to this, but I want to leave all of you with this. Before I go, I wanted to do one small activity again. I want you to go to menti.com again and answer the same statements, rate them on a scale of 1 to 10. The statements are: stories form an essential component of SciComm, and I feel comfortable using storytelling in my SciComm. And the code's different this time, so if you can just go to menti.com and type in this code, you should be able to see this. And once everybody has done that, I can conclude. So I'll also type this on the chat box if you want. Yeah, I've typed it on the chat box also. And while you guys are doing this, I'll sort of just take a moment to do some self-publicity, which is that I have a small discussion forum called the SciComm Sci Club, where we discuss the science of science communication and we look at evidence-based ways of communicating science and how can you make your SciComm more effective, more evidence-based, more engaging. And if anybody of you would be interested, we're not doing in-person events right now, but we do have some online events. You're welcome to check it out. And with that, I'll end my presentation with the thought that the purpose of SciComm is to inform, delight, and engage. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I hope you had a good time. And I hope this wasn't a lot to absorb in a short period of time. I'm very happy to engage with any of you offline after the presentation if you would like to ask questions. And with that, I'll end. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Siddharth. Thanks a lot for such an insightful session. This narrative index actually was a great insight actually. It can actually help all of us assess the accessibility of our writings, and I'm surely going to inculcate that into practice. So thank you so much for such an amazing session. Now I would like to call Pranjal Garg, the president of Project Encephalon, to kindly give the closing remarks and call it a day.
Hi everyone. at the end of, so thank you so much, Siddharth. Thank you so much. It was actually a very great and interactive session, and I think so it is going to help the people who are involved in the science writing mentorship program a lot. So thank you so much. I'll be sharing, I think so I want to share the recording of your talk specifically to the people involved. I'll do that. Okay. So at the end of the Mind Gala Science Communication Workshop, I would like to express my sincerest gratitude to all the participants for your enthusiastic participation, and to the speakers, Dr. Somdatta Karak, Shriya Naidu, and Siddharth Kankaria, for conducting this outstanding, engaging, and extremely innovative workshop. It was a great experience. I would also like to extend my gratitude to the delegate of Indian Academy of Neurosciences, Dr. Pankaj Seth, for informing us about the events and activities conducted by Indian Academy of Neurosciences. I am honored to work with such amazing peers at Project Encephalon and Poonam. Thank you for facilitating and conducting this workshop brilliantly. At last, nothing would have been possible without the support and sponsorship from India Biosciences. We are humbled to receive the second India Bioscience Outreach Grant. In the end, I would like to say, this is not actually the end. We are just beginning our novel science writing communication, science writing program, mentorship program. I wish all the best to all the participants involved in the program. I'm looking forward to your work. Thank you so much for being here. Poonam, do you want to add something?
Thank you, Pranjal, for a very fitting end to this workshop today. And I would really like to thank all the speakers, audience members, and all the team members who have come together today. And thank you so much for sparing a Saturday, spending half a day with us. And I'm sure you all have gained something useful from today's workshop. And we would look forward to your continued engagement with us. Please engage with us via our Twitter handle. There is a Discord community, and there is our website. So you are all welcome to, come and initiate contact with us, and we can, continue discussions further. So if you want to engage in any of the neuroscience activities, any activities of Indian Academy of Neurosciences, if any of the students need member sponsorship to join the Academy, please feel free to reach out to me and our team in general. So thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to, keep engaging with you.